Okay, welcome to the course on Ruby Business Programming in the summer term 2020. Due to the Corona crisis, which probably you're all aware of, we cannot do this as a presence lecture, but we have to do it over distance learning, and that's why I'm going to record the slides as a video and put that on the TU Wien forum. Well, from your perspective, apparently that is already lying in the past and you already found access to the information. Nonetheless, I would like to welcome you. What is going to be expected in this course is that it is since it's a free course in the bachelor program, it's an opportunity for you to learn Ruby and the Ruby on Rails framework by implementing a simple business tasks. We come to the details in a minute. One thing that I would like to say is that everything in this course is done over the TU Wien environment, so if you have any questions, please ask them there. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the course and find a way to make good use of the contents that we have. Okay, so what are our blocks? We have essentially 4 blocks. First, we speak about the administrative side of the course, what are the requirements, what are the deadlines, and so on. Then we will go into a lecture block where I'll give a brief introduction on what Ruby is and what Ruby on Rails is. This is a super brief introduction for a very simple reason. I enjoyed Ruby programming and the Rails framework a long time ago. By a long time ago, I mean, when was that? 2004, 5, and 6. Since then, I hardly had any practice, and therefore it's not really opportune for me to teach you from the practical side. Okay. More important in the third block is to speak about the project, what are the requirements, formal ones and content-based ones, and eventually provide some links in the back matter section. So, now the pre-lecture meeting. The first thing we have to speak about are the contents and the goals. Then we will speak about what is going to happen in this lecture here. There is a small lecture block, even though this course is an exercise. And about the lab course, what you do and where you do it in TU Wien, and eventually how your performance is assessed. Okay, what is going to come? What is going to come is the implementation of a simple business application consisting of a data source that is approached over REST, a search functionality, viewing of data records in list form and in detail form, typical applications in any data management system, plus reporting based on the data. Alongside that come a bit of user management, a bit of security, and so on. We come to that later. The course was designed as a freies Wahlfach, meaning that it is an opportunity for you to actually learn or get in touch with the Ruby on Rails framework, which is quite handy if you do business programming, for example, as a freelancer, and to gain ECTS credits for that. That means that part of the learning has to be done in self-study. I do not provide, as I just said, a comprehensive introduction into the Ruby language for the simple reason that I couldn't do that today anymore. But I provide you, I think, a first step into this world, and also then the further material so that you can learn it yourself. This is the 3rd year that we have been doing this course. In the first 2 years, actually, the concept worked out very well. It has been refined. Again, this year there are a few new requirements and others have been changed or made more precise. So actually, everything, I believe, should work fine. And by the way, you gain also a little bit of experience in a typical small-scale business programming environment, where I am actually your product owner. Okay, so what are the educational goals? What should you take from this course in June? You should actually learn to implement the simple Ruby on Rails server application. You should be able to implement the application with a defined process and defined requirements. It is rudimentary and an agile process. As I said, I'm the product owner. There are predefined requirements. You can approach that as your backlog. At any time you should be able to get feedback if you have questions on the requirements, and you work in pairs, so you're also forming a little group, and therefore it should simulate as far as that's possible in such a small course a typical environment in a small scale software development agency. Okay, that's the second educational goal. And the third one is that you learn to deal with external data sources over a defined interface that we actually practically use at TU Wien, with the REST interface and the descriptions that are transported are in the JSON format. Okay. The last goal is a very small one, is that you learn to present business data also on mobile devices by providing a style sheet. That, however, is only a side goal, I must admit. Okay, what is going to come in the lecture? Well, today, here and now is true for me, but not for you. It should be an advantage for you that you can access the lecture whenever you like. You have to go through the lecture details. I can see that in too well if you listen to it or not. I will not do a multiple choice test this year, but should the whole procedure fail, then for the next year, of course, I will introduce that. Keep in mind that this is a free course. It's an opportunity for you. Take this opportunity. And taking the opportunity means to learn what is on offer, to practice what should be done, and to really take away those goals, those educational goals, those assets that are just outlined. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? We are talking about the requirements and the process, the administrative side, but also a little bit about Ruby on Rails. I just said that there is no break from my side, but of course you can interrupt the video at any time. Major topics are also the Ruby on Rails concept, so that you have a bit of feeling of what is Ruby, or in particular what is the Rails framework's idea, and it's really meant literally you build applications on Rails, so there are many conventions and many definitions. Okay, in the end there is no exam, it's a lab course, but you're graded and assessed based on what you actually provide as a hand-in. How you do that is also explained in the pre-lecture meeting, and registration in TIS is of course mandatory, and also the viewing of the video is mandatory and is actually controlled by me. So if you register for the course, how that is done I'll explain in a minute. I will actually check if all group members watch the video. Okay, what's happening in the lab project? There comes a list of requirements in the third part of this presentation. For now, it is, as I said, implementing a server application, so a gateway between our data in the TIS system and mobile devices. Aspects are searching for people, courses, projects, and thesis. Thesis meaning diploma thesis, presenting the lists of results. And of course, from those lists I can go to a detailed view. If I'm particularly interested in a certain course, person, project, or whatsoever, I can create a favorite. I will show you visual examples of what it should actually look like. And these lists, for that I need creation, read, update, and delete functions, or CRUD functions, and a little bit of user interface design as well. You have to work in groups of 2. That is very important. You never work alone. You have to register your topic in Tuval. I'll show you on the next few slides how this works. I'm your product owner, so I check the requirements. If you have questions on the requirements, you approach me. And very important, there is an intermediate hand-in. Let's see if we can find a text marker here. Yeah, this is mandatory. The deadlines for the intermediate hand-in are on the Tuval page. I believe it's early or mid-May. And the requirements for that hand-in are that you have a first style sheet, that you implemented an abstract controller. What that means is also presented on the next few slides. And one of your controllers, so the management of either people, courses, projects, and thesis, is already implemented. You can repeat multiple times for the final hand-in, before the deadline apparently. Yeah, so you can also improve what. Okay, what does it look like in TU Well? I recorded this as a PowerPoint video, and therefore I cannot go out into the browser directly, so here you have the screenshots. If you go to the TU Well page, which is linked in this and can also be found directly in the TU Well, you have a landing page where until yesterday you would have the important information on the right hand side. Yesterday I thought it might be better and more accessible if I include that also in the main thread, and therefore it's now here beneath the important information on the coronavirus. There you have all the dates. Practically relevant for you is the intermediate hand-in, which is on the 2nd of May, 8 o'clock in the morning. It's a sharp deadline. I will not accept anything beyond that stage, except for a good reason, which is of course a health issue. For example, however, if you have a health issue, you have to warn me in advance, and you also have to send proof, so some certificate of your doctor that you have to are not able to do your work now. Okay, same is the case for the final hand-in, which is on 23rd of June. Also, this is a sharp deadline. Before that time, you can submit whenever you like. You can submit multiple times, but just sending me an email and saying, Professor C, we improved this and that. Please ignore the first one and take this one for the final grading. Fair enough for me. By the way, okay, so what is important in the TU Well forum? In the TU Well forum you have two forums actually. One is open right now, the second task will be opened in June. This is about the grading and the final meetings where we discuss. For now you have a social forum. In that social forum we do all the communication, the course-wide communication. Please, when you have a question, always use this forum. Never send me an email unless your problem is of a purely private, personal nature, like, for example, a health issue. So, what can you find in the TU Well forum, in the social forum? Essentially, there are currently 4 threads. You're allowed to create new threads, of course. One is on useful information, which includes links that are also provided here on these slides. By the way, the pre-lecture meeting slides are of course themselves also on the TU Well in the current updated version. So you should have all information, and you should also have the audio protocol of last year, which is very similar to what I'm explaining now. And from hopefully this afternoon on the 19th of March, you will also already have the video available. So you should actually have full information of what is going to happen and what you have to provide in order to finish the course successfully. Okay, most important thread for you is the registration of groups. Once you watched the video and have understood what the task is, you can go here and register a group. How that is done, I'll explain on the next slide. Furthermore, if you have any questions on the video, you are not here today that I'm recording, and therefore you cannot interrupt me and ask any questions. That is a disadvantage, of course. Still, if questions emerge, please post them into the forum and I'll try to answer as quickly as possible. Last thing, since you have to work in groups, it might happen to you that you don't have a partner if you registered individually. You can then find a partner here by simply answering to this thread, find a partner, and naming, your student identification number. Some students in the past also mentioned how much experience they already had with Ruby, none, or actually went up to semi-professionals and freelancers. And usually people respond then and say, okay, let's form a group. If you shouldn't find a partner within 2 weeks, and there are multiple entries here in this list, I will assign groups. And if by some coincidence one student should end up alone, I will find a special arrangement for this person. But this can happen only to one person. It shouldn't happen at all, but if it happens, it can happen to one person alone. And for that person, I will then reduce the number of requirements, in particular, for example, that you don't have to search for thesis and whatsoever. Okay, but that is then a process of negotiation. Now, Let's return to the registration of groups, and that is on the next slide. Okay, so how do you register? You register by going into this thread, registration of groups, and doing a reply. In your reply, you give the names of the 2 students who participate. You give their student IDs. You give the program IDs of the study program. This is an open course for all sorts of bachelor students. Sometimes bachelor students have subscribed more than one study. So please give me the number here for the study for which you would want to have the certificate. That is very important for me. At the end, when I do the grading, I will look here for which concrete study, if you have multiple, you actually want to have the certificate. Okay, and the last point is, you already define here a name for your project. Can be any string, but it must not contain white spaces, because the project name will also be the name of your Ruby on Rails project. And such a project name must not include a white space. So this is the only requirement here. Once you did your registration, I will check whether you watched the videos or not. If you watch the videos, I will reply and say, okay, go ahead, have fun. If you did not watch the videos, I will make an entry and a reply and tell you, okay, first watch the videos and then you can participate, because the pre-lecture meeting is a mandatory requirement. We cannot do it in presence. The substitute is the video, and please oblige to that and watch the video. Okay, last thing in the pre-lecture meeting, or almost last thing, is the question of the assessment. It is based on your lab project. So what you submit, what you hand in, is what I'm going to look at. We are also meeting in the end. So when you did the hand in by sending me an email with your stuff, if small enough, inside the email, if for some odd reason too big, by linking to some cloud service, I will check all that. I will try the whole functionality. I will install it on my machine, of course, or some special machine that I'm using for hand-ins. And if everything works, I will reply positively, and you will be invited to a final meeting where you can give feedback, where I'll ask you a few questions. This is not an exam. I will not ask you about any details of the Rails framework or the Ruby framework. It is more about the process, about difficulties, challenges you had, ideas for improvement. So it's rather part of the iterative process to make this course better. There is no need to fear this meeting, actually. It is just the final point in the whole process. Okay, if everything works out nicely, I will do the assessments very quickly, and by the end of June or early July, you will actually have your certificate. Of course, active participation in TU Forum is a bonus, so if somebody asks a question on some detail of the programming or has a bug that he or she does not understand or how to solve, and you answer that, then I'll of course take that into account when I do your grading. So that's about it. Yeah, the last thing is an encouragement from my side. Be brave. Make your own decisions whenever you can. When you do, when you implement your stuff, and only when you think it's about a matter of policy, then you actually have to ask a question. My experience was that such behavior is always rewarded, in particular in software developers. This is a highly desired quality. So, summary of the pre-lecture meeting is, the idea is that you learn Ruby on Rails and are rewarded by 3 ECTS points. You have to implement the given requirements. Those follow in the third part of this lecture. You have to submit on time. Deadline extensions are actually only possible in case of health issues. I will, for example, not accept busyness on the job. That is not an excuse. Studies at TU Wien are full-time studies. If you have a job, that is fair enough, but it must not interfere with your performance as a student. And never ever do cheat. We come to the cheating part later again. Okay, now comes the lecture. From the feedback of the first 2 years, this was clearly the part that was least necessary for most of the students. Most already had experience with Ruby on Rails. Those who didn't found the ideas and the concept session in particularly useful because it introduced them to the way of thinking that the Ruby developers should have. The concrete examples are really just a small sample of what is possible. Yeah, you will have to go, if you have no experience, go through the tutorials in order to find a good entry point. So what's the idea of Ruby on Rails? It is certainly targeted towards business applications which are about data management. In the old sense that the data has entered, has been forwarded from one point to another, from a source to a sink, and has to be aggregated in reports and transferred between system components in, for example, the supply chain management. Okay, it is a strict implementation of event-based systems. We will shortly see what that means. It means that everything is widget-based in the front end, triggering controllers, which are then doing changes to the model that we have. The persistence layer, the model layer, is completely transparent. You actually do not have to deal with it if you don't want to. However, if you want to make certain restrictions, so the availability of certain attributes is guaranteed, you can very conveniently do that in the so-called model classes. It is very greedy also, since it's targeted towards business applications. Ruby on Rails makes certain assumptions put down into conventions. That makes the learning process a bit harder for the newcomer, because in the early stages, if you don't know the conventions, you stumble over this and that hurdle. However, once you have appreciated all those conventions, you can implement applications really, really fast, which is a big advantage if you want to do rapid prototyping. This is augmented even by the availability of powerful wizards for the implementation of, for example, new controllers, new views, and of course also the models, which then require you to do a migration of your database, and all that is fully automated. It's really very convenient. Okay, for the development operations, you have a very nice command line interface, which is very efficient. It's not GUI based, but as I said, on the command line, but I think it's every IT student should be able to master that. And the big advantage of the command line is, of course, that it's really precise. When you trigger some command, you really know what you're doing and what is happening. Okay, so in summary, it's rapid evolutionary prototyping of the most efficient form. It is really tailor-made for agile processes. You define your requirements, you implement them in a greedy fashion. You can go into the iteration quickly by doing fast deployment, speaking to the user, is this what you wanted? And the user can give you direct feedback, and you can make changes almost immediately. So it's just perfect for the modern agile process. And there is a developer community, many of them being freelancers and making good money on the market here, in particular in Austria, who are very solution focused, and there is a very good documentation. There are a few focal points where you can go and gather the information that you need in order to do your project. So, in summary, Ruby on Rails is really something interesting. If you want to be a business programmer, it can be very, very beneficial for your career to know the system. Okay, some concepts. Ruby on Rails applications make use of some of the absolute classics of software development. Some of them are so classic they're already a little bit outdated maybe. Most importantly, it is strict model view controller implementation, meaning that in the background you have a model which you hardly ever see if you don't want to, because it's behind a transparent object relational mapper. The controllers, everything that actually implements logic, functionality, is object-based in the Ruby language. These objects, however, are then transformed to entities and relationships between those entities, and that requires you to have a so-called object relational mapper. Okay, on the front-end side, you have a view. View with the usual widgets, possibility to output static text and replace placeholders with widgets and output of some controller. So you have a template language and for which you can use. The views can directly access the controller function, so this is a listener concept. It's just a perfect model view controller implementation. It is not, for example, a model view implementation, as the Microsoft people recently suggested. The controllers are full-featured classes. They can do all sorts of programming and logical implementation, which is, in my opinion, a big advantage of the concept, because it makes clear that on one side, model controller, you have a back-end programmer, and on the view side, you might have a front-end programmer, which are two completely different species with different habits, and it doesn't require, for example, the front-end programmer to do all the back-end logics, if he or she doesn't want to, of course. Okay, second concept is CRUD. CRUD standing for create, read, update, delete. These are the typical functions that are performed on data objects. At some time you create, for example, the address of a customer. At many other times you read it. Once in a while you have to update it, and it might happen that you delete something. If you have experience in business programming, you know that real deletions hardly ever happen. That rather means archiving into a shadow table somewhere else in the system. Still, that's the concept. Okay, when it comes to programming, it's of course object-oriented. Every controller class is inherited from an abstract application controller. So are the models from the so-called active record class, and so on. So everything is object-oriented, and therefore on the model side, since we work with relational databases, we need an object mapper that transforms these objects into entries in some table, some entity, potentially or most often linked to other tables as relations. Okay, data management, apparently the method of choice these days is not web services anymore, but REST interfaces, meaning that we have an HTTP-based protocol with unique resource identifiers in some form, easily readable way that can be merged together or concatenated from individual components. You will practice all that in the course. And for the descriptions that are actually exchanged over these mechanisms, we employ JSON. You could of course also go for XML heavyweight formats, but it's most of the time not necessary because the depth of the structures is not so big, and the simple text format is also sufficient. You will practice all those concepts when you do the Ruby on Rails tasks. Okay, so now let's have a quick look at the programming language itself. As I told you from the feedback I got from students, the most valuable part for them were the links. So to really go to the page and read through the articles themselves. There are more links provided later on back there. I just want to give you a very, very quick hint of what Ruby actually can be. Well, printing hello world is a classic. The idea is that an object, even a static object itself, can actually have methods, like here, for example, computing the size. And it is greedy, as I said, so that, for example, if you don't have any parameters, you can remove the parentheses, which is for some programmers hard to do, including myself, who grew up in the classic time when that, of course, had a big, big meaning. It is, however, state-of-the-art in many other scripting languages as well today. So how do you define a function? By the def, which opens a block until the next end on this block level, of course. And in this argument, we can have arguments for which the types do not have to be specified. So there's no typing in the signatures of the functions. Yeah, and inside you do whatever you like. You can create objects with a new operator, which is a member of every class. And very nicely, if you have one object created, you can also clone it into a second one and make use of the data, for example. Okay, Variables. Arrays are assigned like this, might be used this way, which comes out to a rather awkward form of description, which you can mostly ignore for the simple task that we are doing in the course. As we said before, you can define static objects like strings and use the length function, for example, to get the information, the length of the string in this case. If we actually define an array by using these brackets, then length function has a different context, has a different meaning, which would evaluate in this case also to 3 because there are 3 members. Okay, so what do blocks look like? There are loops, of course, for loops, while loops, and there is an if clause. If clause can fork into different situations depending on the expression that we have here. They are the typical logical operators. We certainly won't go through these details because it's anyway always the same, just the writing is a bit different. A while loop, of course, also has to define an expression which can be evaluated to true or false, and in the block, again, you do whatever you think right. Interesting is the for loop because it's typical Ruby. You have the static object 10, and by employing the function times on it, so it's membership function times, it evaluates down to 1 to 10. With the do, we start the block in which something happens, and also very typical between 2 pipes is defining the bound variables. That is not just used in loops, but also, for example, in the Ruby on Rails template language. We come to examples later. Here also, for example, we have a bound. We have a bound variable on which we employ some function multiplying every member to 2, and doing that for a given array, and with the collect function we say we want to do that in another array, which is then contained of the double values of the inputs. Okay. Other membership functions are for example, delete if function. Again, we have a bound variable and an expression. If that expression evaluates to true, then in this case we perform a delete. So if the value is one of those of the members of the variable, of the array, of the resource, so to say, then this one is deleted, which is a very nice way of dealing with larger lists in particular. You can also do a sorting function by the typical sort operator, which is, for example, the same also as in Perl. And in this case, since we have the B in the front and the A in the back, we will do a reverse sorting of that. Last example that I would like to give is that because it's very often in data management very important, the subfunction allows you to look for a regular expression, in this case either the letter A or C. Putting in them into the square brackets means that it's optional, or it's alternative, either the one or the other, or how many ever options you have. And for the bound variable, that means for every case where this is actually identified in the input string, we convert it to uppercase, meaning that the result for ABC is a big A, a big C, but a small b because of the expression. Of course, regular expressions are very, very important, very, very helpful. If you have no experience with that, take the opportunity to implement part of the project using these expressions. Very, very helpful. So, to summarize, it's very greedy. You can omit part even of the syntax. Definition of blocks is essentially always the same: if, and, def, and so on. The functions defined for statics and variables depend in their output and functionality on the context. Very important concept is to have bound variables that are defined in between 2 pipes, and there are a number of very, very helpful functions that you can use. If you're interested in more details, I provide a link to an introductory tutorial on Ruby later on in the presentation. Okay, So how to deal with REST in JSON and Ruby? There are actually many forms. You know, a JSON format is to put them into these brackets and define an attribute and a value. And of course, these can be stacked into sub and sub and sub clauses and so on. Okay. First of all, you require two packages to do that, two libraries, or gems as they are called in the Ruby language. The one is net HTTP, non-surprisingly, for defining a unique resource identifier, and the other one is JSON for the actual parsing of the data. Okay, so how do you actually request a REST interface? By first defining the resource identifier and then employing an HTTP GET call with the resource identifier and storing the response package in an independent variable. How do you parse it? By employing the parse function of JSON on the response object of the HTTP call. Very simple. And here you see then just one example. We take the output, we know what is in the JSON format, we come to that also later, how do we find that out, and for example extract the title for all the results that we have in the document. Okay. Very simple form. You can take that code directly and use it in your project. Okay, so a few hints on what kinds of assets and technologies you actually have in Rails. There are plenty, of course. One important technology is embedded Ruby, which is the template language for the user interfaces. I give a few examples on one of the next slides. It's very intuitive. The definition of widgets and of placeholders is actually very simple to learn. On the other end, on the model side, we have the active record class, which is the mapper for objects to relations and back, or to entities. It also takes care of all the migrations whenever you change the data model by introducing a new class, for example, linking it to the others. And the fundamental CRUD functions are implemented in the base class and can be extended by you, of course. Okay. These are two fundamental technologies for the one end and the other end. For the controller, apparently the most important technology is the Ruby language itself. Okay, so what assets do we have? The most important asset is a file called roots.rb, standing for Ruby. In the roots file, you define all the resources and their relationships in your projects. Two of them are most important. The one is how views, which are in the end text documents and therefore resources, map to controller functions. So the mechanism for the listeners, for the triggers of the listener functions. So you say that for one particular entry point, when the user, for example, clicks on that or otherwise causes an event, you call of a certain class a particular function, and in that function, of course, you define what is going to happen in this event, which parameters are read, what processing is performed, what changes are made to the model, and in the event, what output is provided back to the user interface. These links are based on conventions for the standard methods. We come to that also in a minute. If you introduce new functionality, you have to edit roots.rb in order to define from where in the user interface you go to where in the controllers. Second important thing on the model side is that for all the entities, you define what relationships they have. For example, we define between articles and comments, articles in the sense of journalism, and comments in the sense of, for example, online media, a one-to-end relationship. This is directly taken from the Rails tutorial, by the way, which is also linked in at the end of this presentation. We define that one article might have many comments, so and one-to-end relationship with this notation. Further things can be done with the roots.rb, but these are the two most important ones for you. You define one-to-end relationships and also, or M2N if you have, and you also define these roots for user events to machine responses. Okay, so where do you find your class files? In the app section of your project, and there you have the controllers where you heavily will edit, models where you will do hardly anything or very little only, and views where you design the templates that you are using. Okay. DB contains the database model. You shouldn't have to edit anything there. Okay, some conventions, just a few of those. Class names always start with a capital letter, with an uppercase letter. The controller file names are always lowercase. The controller use singular, the models actually use the singular names, and the corresponding database tables have plural names. This is quite sophisticated, so if the plural is not just adding an S to the name, then the database table will actually follow the English grammar rule rather than simply adding an S. That might at sometimes be a bit unnerving if you want to do some query on the database level and get the database table does not exist, error in reply. Then it must be in the system lookup table somewhere stated what the real name of your class actually is. Okay, when it comes to methods, the implementation of a public method means that first you have a look at the routes that are already implemented. If it is already there, you create the method in the controller class where it belongs, and you create the view template in the view section. For the standard operations like adding something, updating something, deleting some data entry, all these stubs do already exist. And if it's a standard operation like adding an article or something or deleting a user, you don't have to do anything. You can go with the generated methods. Generation is something that also comes in on one of the next slides. So it's really greedy and really fast. If by coincidence or by the complexity of your requirements you have to add a new function that is not yet there, then you also have to edit the roots RB file and create this new link between front-end asset and back-end controller. Okay. There is a predefined way, a conventional way of in what order you actually have your functions, and these are generated by the system. The first is index and the second is show. Index lists all elements of a certain class type. So for example, all articles. Show shows the detail for one particular article, for example, for one entry. It's a detailed view. So for example, for an article, we would show all the comments along the article details, not just the title, or also contents and so on. New creates a view and edit provides a change view. New means that you create the view that you need to create a new item for a certain type of object, for data object. Edit means to provide the user interface for changing it. Okay, so these work on the view, new and edit. Create, update and delete or destroy. Create, update and destroy. Perform the operations on the model side. Create creates it, update changes it, destroy deletes it or archives it, whatever you do. Instance variables, as I said, have an @ as a prefix. Parameters always come with 2 dots. Okay, and the array params we already saw in an earlier example contains the parameters that come to the view to the controller and therefore are part, of course, of the HTTP request and also are the data link between views and controllers. Okay, what is Erb Markup? So the front ends, the templates for the front ends, of course it can contain any form of HTML's static text. You can create forms, which is most interesting for new and edit of objects and of data, which is with the form width tag. You can have a lot of options in there. You have a bound variable, which might be the form, for example, and so on. The scope is the class on which you're actually working, which is then the article, and so on. Okay, so what inside the form, what can you add? You can add label data, doing some output of, for example, data that is already stored in the system. You can create all sorts of input widgets, checkboxes, radio buttons, combo boxes, input fields, and in the event a submit button. For a complete list, follow one of the links of the tutorials that are provided at the end. It's always the same, they are part of the form. The label has a certain link to a certain data object, a certain attribute, paid and title, and when we follow, or when somebody presses the submit button, the user presses the submit button, then these data are forwarded to the controller with exactly these names and can be approached and employed from the params object that is provided with the call. As I said before, the call itself is defined in the routes table. Okay, if you want to output data, you have the possibility of looping over subfields, for example, by using that instance variable articles and saying that for each of those bound variable, again, for each of those articles, you, for example, write the item here in a table, HTML table, and giving the title each. Yeah. So it's a very simple, very easy to use notation. Two things. A back button could be implemented like this, for example, and validation, which you have to implement, can simply be done with an if clause, giving the instance variables, checking for their errors, and if there are any in the response, or subsequently you can implement some intelligent handling mechanism, which you should do, and you will see when we come to the requirements. Okay, so what are typical declarations that you have, in particular in the model classes, which is the upper section of the slide? Of course, validation is important, so that it is guaranteed that in the database we only have valid data, for example, not null data or a minimum length as it is shown here. Here we validate a field called the title. We request it to be there, so it must not be null, and we furthermore say that it has a minimum length of 5 characters. In this form, other requirements can be defined and are then automatically evaluated by the system. Of course, the automatic evaluation and handling of exceptions can be overwritten by your own logic, as always in Ruby on Rails. Okay. In a model class, furthermore, you won't just do validation, but you can also define the entity relationships by saying in the n-to-1 direction that one comment, for example, belongs to the class of article, thus implicitly defining an one-to-n relationship between the two. And from the other direction, to make the link double sure, you can say has many. So one article has many comments. Absolutely straightforward. Okay, what can be done in the controller classes in terms of automatic declarations? You can, for example, here for the class article in the new function, which means we would create a view, we can define that in the params, in the parameters, we require that there is an article object. And for this article object, we allow it to have a title and a text. Will an article come along with a title, a text, and the comments? This would throw an error. So this is a validation of what is actually coming along in that article instance variable. So permit defines a whitelist, whereas require more or less defines the binding of a certain type of object. Okay. The find function, I think, is self-explanatory. You provide some ID in this case and want to find a particular article, store it there. Save calls active record to actually store something to the database. And a redirect is a simple web operation for the front end where we can go to a particular instance of the data. Of course, These are just a few examples to give you a first idea of how Ruby on Rails works. From those, you should actually conclude that with very few statements, you can actually implement complex functionality. And that I found in the last 2 years was one of the major challenges of this course. Novices, beginners in the Ruby world try to enforce certain logics by in detail stating what they would like to happen. That is not how it's done in Ruby, and with experience you actually learn how to do it properly on Rails. Very often a simple declaration, a one-liner, is sufficient to implement the logic that in other programming environments would request you to do 20, 30, 40 lines of coding. To learn that should be one of the major goals of this course. So even if you started out and implemented rather awkward structures, go ahead, refactor your code, improve it, so that in the event you have a nice project with a minimum line of codes. Okay, DevOps comments. On the development side, you can create a new project by saying with the Rails command, which is of central importance here, please create new project. You give it a name, like for example article or whatsoever, or news project, news blog, something like that, and it creates a lot of things in the background. Best effort model classes, best a routes table, and so on. You can then create your new controllers by just naming them and saying what actions you would like to have. The standard actions that we mentioned before are automatically created. You can create new entities by saying that I want to generate a new model with a name, and I can also give the attributes and the database types. Character objects, number objects. There is a make utility which is called rake. Okay, so this is a bit on the dev side what you have. On the operating side with Rails you also start the server, which is then available from the port that you specified. There is a default port, I think it's 8008 or 8000. Can't remember anymore. You can at all times, if you change something on the controller side, do a database migration, and the Delta scripts are automatically generated by the systems. And you can also look at the routes table by showing all the routes, for example, or do that with rake also. Okay. So with that one tool, Rails, you can actually create a lot of stuff. Best effort implementing functions in the controllers and templates already, and you can also run the server environment. In summary, Ruby on Rails is certainly absolutely non-compromising when it goes to fast, rapid prototyping in the business world, which is mostly data management on all sorts of levels. You are required to have a high level of experience, because otherwise the conventions will rather be in the way than be helpful. However, if you achieve that high level of expertise, then you can extremely fast implement certain functionalities. Operating is best performed, as I said, on the command line, which might appear a bit old-fashioned, but in my opinion is still the most efficient way of doing that. Okay. Now we come to the requirements of the project. Feedback of the last 2 years was clearly that this is the most valuable part, since we have a clear description of what you should actually do. Students never developed anything in the wrong direction, and were very happy that when they met all the requirements, they got very efficient feedback and could finish the course fast. So, let's have a look at the requirements, at the approach that you should take based on the experiments of the last 2 years, and then in particular we will go into the details of the REST services that you should use. I tested all of them, they are all working, and it should actually be a nice experience for you to employ them, because you learn a lot about how TU actually works and what sort of data we are storing. Okay, the overview. So what should you do? You should develop a gateway. A gateway is a server that on a high level transforms input data into an output form that is readable for a certain environment. In our case, we want mobile clients to approach and use data that is available in the TIS backend on people, meaning lecturers, on theses that were written in the past, and other functions, including, for example, courses. So you can basically provide your own server environment for using the TIS data. That is all based on HTTP between the client and the gateway, of course, and also between the gateway and the backend, there with the top layer of the REST requirements for doing that in an appropriate fashion. You implement this part, the gateway to the mobile client. You just use this data and the access mechanism provided through REST. Okay, what you have to do in the course is create, read, update functions for favorites, search functions for thesis and so on, and abstraction into an application controller that provides that it only needs to parameterize for a certain application. Very important, follow in detail the regulations of the hand-ins. It worked very nicely in the last 2 years, and I'm absolutely positive that it will also work this year. Okay, so what could it look like? As I said, we want to go for the mobile phone when it comes to the user interface design. One entry point, of course, is a main menu where I have a search for people, thesis, courses, and others. If I follow one of the search functions, then I must be able to enter some search strings. I must be able to start the search. And of course, I must be able to see the favorites in that area. But that might also be in the main menu. I don't care where you actually put those things. Okay, once you triggered the search, the output of the index function will be a set of results. Starting here with Christ, we have a Christian Breiteneder, who retired actually last year in September. Christian Huemer, the Dean of Student Affairs, and another one is Christopher Frauenberger, who just finished habilitation and is now an associate professor. Okay, if I go for the details view, I might be able to retrieve information with the title, the full name, and even a photo of the person. All that is available on the REST interfaces. And from there I should be able to link to courses done by this person, projects done by this person, thesis. And I should be able to add him to the favorites. Okay, if I'm interested in the favorites from the main menu or from the search page, whatever you prefer, I should see a list that I can then sort by name, for example, or by entry date. And of course I can go to the detail view, show function, or I can remove them with the destroy function from the favorites. And here removal means real removal. So these are the main functions. There are small side things, there is user management and so on, but those are, I think, quite clear, and I didn't have to show them graphically. We come to the list of the requirements on one of the next slides. Okay, now to the application requirements. You have to fulfill 10 requirements. The first one is that you have to provide a registration functionality, just user and password, and the login for the usage of the system. That is very simple to do. And that would lead you to a main menu with the 4 search functions for the 4 data categories that we have. The second requirement is that you implement the search functions. That is linked to the third requirement, because I want you to do a mother controller. That means the search functionality itself should be, as it is the same over the REST interfaces for the 4 data categories, should already be implemented in the mother controller, and then only parameterized for the individual data categories. So there is the mother controller, and there are 4 subcontrollers, 4 people, courses, and the like. And each one receives the parameters it needs in order to approach the REST interface and to parse the results. That caused a little bit of confusion last year because you said it has to be an abstract controller. That is not a requirement. It's just a mother class that you use for the 4 individual controllers.
Okay, you have to implement a bit of validation. So everything that is entered into a form, into an edit field in particular, needs to be validated by a proper function. Rails provides very handy function for checking of validation in the front end, so that happens very fast without a call to the back end. And you should use that in order to guarantee that no empty strings are provided to the search functionality. The fifth requirement is that the search results have to be provided in a list first, and from the list, individual entries can be picked for detail view, or they can be added to the favorites. Okay. So usually it goes main menu, search function, list of results, details, and or favorites. That is the path of usage. Okay, the sixth requirement is that, as we said, you have to optimize all your views for smartphone usage, so for small screens. Therefore, you should minimize the amount of white space, of course, and all your styling should be based on a self-defined cascading style sheet. That should be quite simple, and as I said, make maximum use of the space available in order to present the data. Past years have shown that the students provide quite stylish individual designs, which is very nice to have. So try to be creative here. Seventh requirement is that there must be the favorites, and in the favorites it must be possible to view the details, it must be possible to remove entries, and very important, you have to provide a sorting functionality by registration date, means when was the favorite created, and by the title, person name, name of the course, and so on. This is highlighted because this is the one function that is usually forgotten by the students in the hand-ins, and that of course should not happen. Now, for the sorting, there are two general ways to do that. You can call the backend and do the sorting there and return a new mask that shows the sorted list. That is, of course, heavyweight and takes considerable amount of time. Ruby on Rails as a data processing system provides better functionalities that allow to do the sorting directly in the front end by the proper declarations in the input screens, in the templates for the screens. Find out how this is being done in order to provide a functionality that is as fast as possible. I would like to remind you that this is one of the educational goals of the course, of the small educational goals, is that to find out how things can be done quickly in Ruby on Rails. There are usually shortcuts to most solutions of data handling, and this sorting is a typical example. So furthermore, in the detail view of favorites, so when I see, for example, a person with the photo and name and academic degrees and whatever the interface provides, it must be augmentable. That means it must be possible to enter strings of keywords, character strings, and also personal notes in a larger edit field. Like, for example, I like this person because she's a good presenter, or she's very fair in the grading, for example. She's very quick in answering emails, and so on. Whatsoever, this should be addable, augmentable to the entries, to the data that comes. And it has to be, of course, managed in the database. So it must not get lost between sessions. So, second to last requirement is I want you to do a reporting functionality in the main menu that allows for viewing a printable list of favorites. That should be simple text style. You don't have to provide a PDF, and neither do you have to care about the printing itself. That will be done by the system, in particular by the web browser. All you have to do is to think about how the data that you have can be rendered into a proper report. They can be then put on paper with pagination and so on. So this is another type of view next to the web browser view, the interactive one, so to say. You provide the printout report. The last requirement, the 10th, is new this year because student again complained last year that the task was too easy. So what you have to provide now is an additional functionality that allows for one person, that is either in the favorites or not, so it has to include search, for one person to add all the data that is available, all the courses, all the master thesis, all the projects that can be found in the interface. And these are then presented in one report, in one interactive report, not for printout, but on a web page. Plus, there is an additional functionality. There has to be an edit field where the user can enter a search expression, and you provide interactive highlighting. So for example, if I enter into this field the string virtual and augmented reality, after pressing the search button, all parts of the text should be highlighted that either go virtual reality or augmented reality, as the regex, the regular expression, says here in this example. This functionality should of course be implemented again by using proper Rails function. There is a very efficient handling of regular expressions there, and I thought it's a nice add-on for you to get a little bit of experience also how to include that sort of functionality. Again, of course, we need validation of the string so that not empty searches can be started or empty highlighting can be started. Good, that's about it for the requirements. Take care to implement all of them. Just one note, some of the requirements are only relevant in the final hand-in, others are already relevant for the intermediate hand-in, and of those most important is the mother class for the search functions. That is something you should already provide in the intermediate hand-in. Good. So, what are the formal requirements of your projects? Of course, you must implement this gateway server. As I said, it has to be based, of course, on Ruby on Rails, and it must be able to run under Windows 10 on the 64-bit operating system, because that is the test environment that I will use. This year, I decided to go for Ruby version 2.7.2.1. I didn't dare risking to switch already to version 3. Rather stay on the conservative side, and I would like you to use the Rails version 6.1.1. This is a mandatory requirement. If it turns out that you used a different version and therefore some of the functionality doesn't run in the test environment, I will not try to fix that because it takes way too much time for me. I'll just count these requirements as not delivered. So please use precisely the version provided. Okay, for the REST interfaces, examples are given here in this video. There is also further information in the forum, in the TU forum. I listed again all the interfaces that are available there. And by the way, when you log into TIS, you also have the possibility to look up in the administrative page on the administrative tab the interfaces that are provided. They are constantly being updated, functionality is added. You need not use the function of the version of the REST interfaces that I use in my examples. You can always use a newer one as well. That is all fair enough. So there is no version requirement on the REST interfaces. Okay, all styling aspects must be encapsulated in a cascading style sheet. I really don't want to see style information in one of the templates. Please do not use Node.js or similar libraries. That is simply not the goal of this course. We are not doing web technologies here. We are trying to implement Ruby on Rails, data handling, and interaction programming. Okay, you have to provide the typical user management function. That means create, read, update, and delete users. You must store these accounts on the server. Each user has a username and a password, so there must be a state-of-the-art registration page. Due to past problems, I have to add that bcrypt and Argon 2, please don't use them. They must not be used in this course because we had so many problems with installation and versioning and so on. Okay, furthermore, very important for your project, provide all the sources, of course, but also provide a README file that explains how your system is installed and anything that needs to be known for the usage, plus your student data, of course. So that means name, student registration number, study program number, and an expressive timesheet for each group member. And that means either a spreadsheet or a text file that includes on what day you worked on what requirement for how long, plus a summary at the end that lists or summarizes how many hours you actually worked on the project. These are the formal requirements. To repeat, most important, use precisely the versions required here. Thank you very much for that.
So what do I recommend you to do based on the experience that we had in the last years? Work together as a team. Don't work alone and distribute the workload of the requirements, but sit down together and try to find out how Ruby works together. Use the same operating system, even if you have two PCs working on them. Always do that, because otherwise you get into a lot of trouble in incompatibilities between the operating systems. Also use the same development environment. We come to that in a minute. Okay, first, of course, install Ruby on Rails. A link is provided later on. Most colleagues in the past preferred Linux. I always worked under Windows, even though I'm a great Unix fan and have been using Unix for more than 30 years now. But it also comes in handy when you have Office on your machine and stuff. So why not installing it there? It's actually fair enough. It's a sufficiently good thing, yeah. Colleagues also recommended to use a Linux subshell for the DevOps part. I am still a fan of Cygwin, but students strongly prefer the Linux subshell, and that is fair enough for me. First of all, learn to use the Linux command environment in order to generate the first project, and then start learning Ruby if you don't know it yet. Most of the colleagues said that the tutorial provided in this slide set is very, very good. They were very happy with it. Take the time, first learn the language thoroughly, and based on that, learn the Rails environment with all its conventions and definitions and blah. That is the right way to do. Most colleagues, as an IDE, recommended using RubyMine, which is certainly a very good integrated development environment. Still, I like to use lightweight editors. There is also a link for the Notepad++ if you want to use that. Okay, once you are thoroughly able to program Ruby, learn the Rails environment through the beginner's guide. There is also a link below, which was commented as very positively by the students. Then implement a small demo project extended by CRUD functions, so to get a little bit into the way how database migrations are done, how links are done, how templates can be fulfilled, and so on. Then I would personally experiment with the REST interfaces provided. That is still to come, how to use them. And once you have understood that, integrate that into your project. Yeah, and then comes the actual part, gluing everything together, implementing it, abstracting the search environment, and one after the other implementing all the requirements. Take care. The abstract controller has to be there already on the midterm hand-in. So you don't actually have much time to spare. This is 2nd of May. We are already end of March. I mean, it can easily be done, of course, in a few hours. But don't waste time. Do it as quickly as possible. Still, also as thoroughly as necessary. Okay. In the very end, refurbish the stuff by adding the style sheet. As I said, don't employ a sophisticated system available on the net, but do your own style sheet so that you get a bit of feeling of what's going to happen there. User interface design is not in the focus of the course. It should be as simple as possible. Test everything, pack it, in particular test for Windows 10. and submit on time. Very important for the intermediate handling, but also for the final one. In the process, if you have any questions, formal, on the requirement, whatsoever, post them in the Tubal forum, in the social forum that I named in the pre-lecture meeting part. Some practical issues. I still like Notepad++, but most of the students use RubyMine. Fair enough for me. The conventions have to be learned. That is something, knowledge that you have to practice. If you understand them well, you can implement, as I said before, stuff very, very quickly. That is where you should get. You should not enforce certain behavior by implementing it line by line as you would do in other programming environments, but rather understand what the spirit of Ruby on Rails is and make use of the many predefined things. For most of the standard problems that you can have in application design, non-surprisingly, there is already a solution in Ruby on Rails. Okay, document your source code well. That means on 3 levels. On the level of the architecture, classes, what they are doing and how they are communicating, the API, which is the individual methods and so on, and inline if you have anything that is particularly complex, which might be, for example, the abstract controller. I expect you to provide documentation. I'll look into the source code, and of course the documentation has to be in English. The worst English is still accessible to more people than, for example, excellent German. Okay. When you work with the REST interfaces, there is a small issue with the certificate that has to be installed on first time use. I think that is still the case. Here is the link to the Stack Overflow article where you get the details of how you implement that. It's just 2 or 3 actions that you have to take, and then it works nicely. But you don't have to look for it. Take what the colleagues recommend. So, here are the TIS services. You should use 4 of them: people, courses, project, thesis. Few people know that TIS is not just an online system, but that it comes along with a lot of API definitions that are documented in TIS itself. Most importantly, and that has been a stepping stone, not a stepping stone, but a hurdle for some of the people, is you have to be logged into TIS. If you're remotely accessing, you need a VPN connection to the TU net, and you have to log into TIS in order to be able to access the TIS REST interfaces, such as the GUI version of the system. That's important. Okay. Then we have 4 types of interfaces. It's all REST, so it's always a certain string. This is version 2.1. You will see that for the people, of course, there is already an advanced version 2.2. If you want to use the newer version, be my guest. I don't care actually of what interface you provide. That is anyway an active parameterization of the abstract controller. So you can also use later versions. Some of the REST interfaces have pagination already, saying that I want to have the first N or the 3rd page or whatsoever. When it matters, we also have German and English pages available. Yeah. And the search interfaces always give you the opportunity to define a search string. Sometimes for an attribute called Q, it's always a get interface, of course, as it's REST. Sometimes, most of the time, it's called search term. For white spaces, you use a plus. Okay, you are supposed to use these interfaces, therefore you try them. That comes on the next slides. If you have questions on how to do that in Ruby on Rails, how to exactly call it, there is an advanced article in the Tubal forum under this link where you have the exact code for accessing elements, for example, of the response object. You are allowed to use that copy-paste and of course adapt it in whatever fashion you need it. Okay. So how do you get an understanding of what actually is happening? We know the request side, that was on the last slide. What does the response look like? That is something you can look up in your browser, in the browser of your choice, by defining a query string, executing it on the TIS REST interfaces, and having a look at the response object, in particular the JSON part. There you see that it might be a result set. Every result might have an ID. The ID might refer to a person ID in TIS. It's a person entry here, so we have a first name, a last name, a gender, male or female, or I think now it's also neutral or other, plus a link to an image. If the link is relative, of course, it always refers to TU Wien, and so on. And there might be additional information on that person. So, if the search term was ambiguous, here it was Christian Huemer, there is just one, I believe, in our faculty at least, but if it was like Christian, and there are many Christians here at the faculty, then you would have further elements that need to be parsed. As I said, the parsing is explained in the Tubal forum because it was a bit of a problem for some of the students. You can use that code to implement your functionality in the abstract controller and for the parameterization in concrete controllers for the individual search functions. Yeah, and if you're experiencing any problems in the process, please post them in the Tubal forum. So, eventually, regulation for the hand-in process itself. So far we heard about best practices, we heard about formal requirements, we heard about content requirements. But how do you actually submit? You register your project at Tubal once you have watched the video. As I said, I check on that. Then, there you define a unique lab project name without the white space. I think that's also understood. Once finished, you zip your project folder, the one you generated with the Rails command, and email it to me. If for some odd reason too large, which actually should not happen, put it on a cloud service and send me the link. Any cloud service is fair enough. The final hand-in must also comprise a README file, as I said, plus all usage information if something would be special, in particular in the password encryption and or database usage. And I want to have really good expressive timesheets. That is something on which I'm really picky, because from the timesheets I can conclude what you did and how much time it cost you. People are not very honest, is my experience, and therefore I want to have this information. Okay. If everything is okay, all the requirements are met, and I'm happy with the test run, I will reply you with a list of time slots. Matter of fact, this is automated these days in Tubal and will be opened as an individual page in the Tubal forum, and I'll give you the link only in the email, and there you can pick a time slot of your choice, convenient for both team members, because you have to both be there at the meeting where we discuss the run of the project and the result and potentials for improvement in the future. As I said before, if you experience any questions, post them in the forum. So in summary, implement all the application formal requirements, follow the recommended approach. It is based on the experiment of more than 20 groups, more than 40 people over the last 2 years, and students said use RubyMine and the Linux subshell for the development process. So what's left? A little bit of back matter, mostly links to literature, and a bit of more information. Okay, useful resources. I got very positive feedback on that tutorial, which explains how to use Ruby on Rails. That's why I made it bold here. I also got positive feedback on the Ruby tutorial. If you're a newbie to Ruby, go to this one first and only then go to the Rails environment. In Ruby you learn the language, which is a requirement for implementing the controllers. In the Rails environment you learn all the conventions and ideas and the philosophy, if you will, behind this system. Okay. Recommended software is of course RubyMine. The link is here. I also provide the link to the old stuff if you're a little bit old-fashioned, just like myself. The Rails installer is here. Please mind that we work with a specific version of the Rails framework and of the Ruby language, Ruby 2.7.0, Rails 6.0.2.1, I believe. It is on an earlier slide. Okay. Furthermore, using HTTP and JSON is again explained here, but you also already have the concrete examples of what you can do in the TU forum, so maybe that might be a quicker start than going through the formal descriptions. And at the beginning you will have this SSL problem. Please do what they say on Stack Overflow in order to solve it quickly. You shouldn't waste any time on that. Do's and don'ts. Do is be active. When you are in doubt, ask questions. Try to implement a Ruby philosophy, if you will, a Rails philosophy. So do everything best effort. Be bold. Only if it's really about something fundamental, whether or not you're allowed to use a certain gem because it already solves like 50% of the task that you're supposed to do, only then write a question into the forum. But then you really should do it. Okay. Ask questions immediately. Don't come along just 2 days before the deadline. Start early, finish early. Reflect what you did and possibly refactor, improve it. So become a better programmer. That's the purpose of the course. Take notes when you watch the video, apparently, but also when you implement, and open questions, for example, and try to answer them by doing literature work by yourself. There is one big don't. Never submit source code that was not written by you, of course, and your project colleague, your project member. It is standard procedure for me. It has been for 20 years now that everything that is submitted to me automatically goes into a source code checker. One that is not available on the net, but one that was written by myself and includes everything that was submitted in the past. I have been working now for almost 25 years in the area of information retrieval, and I believe my checker, improved over time, is actually a very good one. I don't want to see anything that was submitted last year or the year before. If you do that, you are immediately kicked out of the course, no reset, no negotiating, and it's a negative mark. This course is an opportunity for you to learn something and even be rewarded for that. If you pay back by submitting a plagiarism, then I really become angry. Most of the course is easygoing, but if you do that, I become very, very angry. So caution, caution, caution here. Don't do that. Of course, the textual stuff is not relevant here, as we are here in a complete programming environment. Okay, if you're interested in what the TU's line is in terms of plagiarism, there is first of all a guideline, which is linked here. It's an awkward link because the colleagues in the administration obviously are not aware that in URIs adding white spaces is maybe not a good idea. However, if you copy paste this link, it actually works. And we have a code of ethics also at the faculty level. It might be beneficial to have a look at that one as well. Okay, so mostly easygoing this course if you follow the guidelines, if you implement the requirements. There's only one thing that I really, really hate, and that's plagiarism. And why do I hate it? Because it makes the whole project obsolete. It drains the sense out of the project. You should learn Ruby on Rails so that you can use it in your projects, so that you can assess if it would make sense to use Ruby on Rails in a project. If you don't submit your own stuff, meaning that you actually implement your own project, you haven't learned anything. You have, matter of fact, wasted your time. Don't do that. Okay, eventually more information, literature, how-tos, etc. can be found in TUWell. There's a thread with useful information. If you find something cool, please post it there. That is also part of the grade in the event. The TUWell course is linked in TIS. Here you find the link again. Is of course obsolete because you are anyway watching the video, which is on the TUWell already. If you have questions of a very personal nature that cannot be stated in the forum, then please send me an email. Be a little bit patient. I'm only part-time at the university, which means I'm there 3 days a week, but I read my emails every day. So I'll try to answer as quickly as possible. If for some odd reason that I can actually not imagine something should be urgent, then put the word urgent in uppercase into the subject line. I'll try to come back to you as soon as possible. This actually worked out brilliantly so far. Since I don't know, as it's not the present course this year, whether you all speak German or not, please, everything that you post in the forum, post it in English. That is also good practice, because software development is mostly international work, and we all have to work in English, and this is the global language of communication. So, having said that, let's summarize. This is your opportunity to learn Ruby on Rails, which is super cool when it comes to doing business applications. Implement all the requirements, the formal ones. The most annoying one is, of course, that in the event I want to test under Windows 10. Most of you will hate that. I apologize for it, but it's simply convenient, because then I can use the existing test server. And yeah, that is also something that happens in the practice, so it can be justified doing that. Okay, very important, submit on time. Never ever endeavor on plagiarism. That is cheating. We don't want that. It's bad style. It's really not what we are up to here at TU Wien. Okay, whatever questions you have, post them in the forum. Last thing, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have fun and find Ruby as interesting as I found it when I was your age, and still like it, but I'm not a software developer anymore, and therefore for me it's not relevant anymore, but it might turn out to be an interesting occupation for you. So enjoy the course and have fun.